Joining me today is author Creek Stewart, author of Disaster Survival 101, the essential guide to preparing for and surviving any emergency scenario. In an unpredictable world, the ability to adapt and survive is more critical than ever. World-renowned survival expert Creek Stewart shares a comprehensive guidebook that offers you the book tools, strategies, and confidence to face any emergency scenario head-on. From natural disasters and power grid failures to terrorist attacks and pandemics, he delivers step-by-step survival plans for more than 20 real-world crises. Whether you are deciding to shelter in place or evacuate, the book empowers you to make the right call and execute it with precision, packed with practical, actionable advice. You'll learn everything from securing water and food to generating power, providing first aid, and even navigating self-sufficient living in the face of disaster. His survival wisdom has been featured on the Weather Channel, The Today Show, Fox and Friends, Men's Fitness, and Outdoor Life. Welcome to the show, Creek.
Well, it is an honor to be here, and that intro made me sound way smarter than I actually am.
Well, I don't think so. After reading the book, you are very smart. You are knowledgeable. You know how to prepare us. Uh, I guess the first question is, what does set your book apart? Why is your book different than all the other disaster books that we maybe attempt to read, or too afraid to read, close
Yeah,
the book, I don't want to deal with this.
yeah.
But yeah.
That's a great question. So I think there are two things really is number one, I'm a very normal person. I'm a husband and a father of two young kids. And so this book is very practical. It is not in the vein of a doomsday mentality of you need a bunker in your backyard and an arsenal. So this is really more of for the average person who wants to implement some very basic and simple and inexpensive strategies that can move the needle in a big way in the preparedness department for themselves and for their family. My goal with this book is to make this a subject that is not intimidating. Because if you just Google disaster preparedness, you can feel very overwhelmed very quickly, and this book is the opposite of that.
Okay, so this book is Disaster Survival 101. And as I hear you talking, it's really grounded in reality.
Right.
But we all live, this is a big country, so there are different kinds of disasters. We had the fires in California, we have the hurricanes in Florida, we have tornadoes. Do we look at certain parts of the book for different kinds of disasters, or
Yeah.
yeah, how do we do that?
Great question. So, in the second half of the book, I actually cover 23 of the most likely to happen disasters in the United States, at least, and offer very specific advice and direction on each of those. But the first half of the book is broken down into a couple of different sections: staying at home, sheltering in place in the event of a disaster, or evacuating in the event of a disaster. And disasters are going to require typically one of those two things. Either you're going to hunker down at home and wait it out, or the safest decision is to get out of Dodge and go to a safer destination. So that's going to depend on the specific disaster. It's going to depend on the people, the place, the what's happening in the environment, and everything that surrounds that. But the good news is that regardless of the specific disaster, there is crossover in the preparation. Like, even if you were preparing for a wildfire versus a hurricane, we all have the basic human survival needs in disaster. So the same thing: shelter, water, fire, food, first aid, and tools. And so even if you were preparing for one, maybe you live in Florida and you're preparing for hurricanes because that's the most likely thing to happen in your region. If something else happens, you're going to have a lot of those preps in place already, simply by preparing for the most practical disasters.
Okay, so what about communication? You have a big family, and
Hmm.
yeah, and in one of those disasters, five, six people in the family, as opposed to somebody who's living by themselves and has to to, do everything to mitigate the issues all alone. What's the difference?
Yeah. So
Communication.
communication is huge. And I'm glad you brought that subject up because it's a preparedness topic that a lot of people think of when it's too late. Everyone likes to think of food and water and first aid, but communication is huge because natural disasters typically knock down the modern types of communication that we depend on, whether it's landline telephone or whether it's cellular communication or internet. And so having a communication in plan is super, super important. Time and time again, history tells us that your first responders in disaster are your neighbors. They are not necessarily the fire department or the police department. They are your neighbors. And so just knowing your neighbors and knowing how to get in touch with your neighbors is the first step of any communication plan. But having a backup way to communicate with your family via two-way radios, whether it's ham radio or GMRS or the simple walkie-talkies that you buy at the local sports store, just having some way to communicate back and forth while normal communications are down is really, really important. It's a huge topic that's oftentimes overlooked.
All right, so what else should we know? Let's say you have children. I'm trying to think of the demographics of people who have to do exactly what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Have kids, lots of young children, if you have disabled people, or if you have, you have a whole gamut of the types of people who are going to be trying to either stay or evacuate. And does that impact your decision?
You do. So, let's talk about one category that involves everyone. So, one subject that I've learned that most people are underprepared to deal with is water. Water is a modern convenience that most people just take for granted, that you turn on the tap and clean drinking water is going to come out every single time. And that is just not the case in many natural disasters. Either it doesn't come out of the tap or it is polluted because of maybe sewage or something, or chemicals getting into the water. So let's just quickly cover three categories of water that will pretty much solve almost everyone's survival water preps. So the first category is we want to have some fresh water storage on hand in the house at all times. Water is heavy and bulky, so you can't have a ton of it unless you have a lot of space. But I recommend 1 gallon per day per person for 2 weeks. So just do the math for your family, and you can store that either bottled water or jug water or in larger containers like 5-gallon jugs or even 55-gallon drums in a basement or garage. So freshwater storage for 2 weeks. The next part of the water equation is you want to have a gravity-fed filter for when that water runs out so that you can pour sourced water through a gravity-fed filter. I use one called the Pro One filter. You can get it on Amazon. It's like $150. You pour water in this big portion on the top. It goes through a ceramic and or charcoal filter and comes out clean to drink on the other side. You can pour in rainwater, water from a creek or a pond, or even a puddle outside. But what about those people who don't have a renewable water source in their backyard, like a pond or a creek? So the third category of water is going to be a rain barrel attached to the downspouts of your house. A rain barrel, for most people in the United States at least, is going to solve their renewable water source. There's only a few areas that don't receive enough rain to create a renewable, dependable water source. So if you have those three simple things in place, you've covered almost 90% of your potential water problems in the event of a large-scale disaster.
But, okay, next question, Creek. What about people who live in apartment buildings? They don't live in a single dwelling house.
That's great. So that's going to eliminate the rain barrel, right? So
Yeah.
instead of a rain barrel, you're going to want to think about, where is my closest renewable water source? Is there a pond? Is there a creek? Is there a place where I could put a 5-gallon bucket under a water spout, under a downspout of my apartment complex temporarily? Is there a naturally occurring spring locally that I could walk to gather water. So the people who live in apartments, they're going to have to get a little bit more creative. And the downside of living in an apartment is that you also have less space to store water. And so you really are going to have to identify where is your closest renewable water source.
Now, you touched on costs, but let's get into that because,
Mm-hmm.
people are listening saying, oh, that sounds great, but it's really too expensive and we can't afford it. We just can't do that.
Yeah, so it's a great question. So I learned a long time ago when I got into this business that the harder and the more expensive something was to do, the least likely people were to get it done. And so literally all of the strategies that I put together in this book, I filter them through those two things. How hard is it to do and how expensive is it? And hardly anything in this book is hard to do and or expensive. I'm convinced that anyone on any budget, even if you're a single parent with multiple kids on a very tight shoestring budget, can over the course of several weeks and months put together some really solid preps in place on a very, very, very tight budget.
Okay, well, that answers the question. There's no excuse not to do it, I guess is what you're saying. And I'm going to say climate change, whether we believe in it or not, it's happening.
It is
And
happening.
yeah, it is happening. It doesn't matter what we believe.
Right.
So yeah, right. You're giving us the practical information about what we have to and we need to do. What about some examples? Like, I mean, you've had so much experience, like where it works. I mean, you have stories like
I
people who,
do.
yeah. Okay. Tell us some stories.
I have a really unique um, I have a really unique place in this industry as a wilderness survival instructor and as a disaster preparedness instructor and consultant. So, my first book, Build the Perfect Bug Out Bag, was 12 years ago on how to build a disaster evacuation kit. And then I spent the next decade or so as the in house survival expert for the Weather Channel, where I got to see so many of these natural disasters firsthand and filmed a show even for the Weather Channel where we interviewed people who had lived through survival scenarios and we learned from those people. And whether it was a wildfire in Colorado or a hurricane in Texas, I saw so many commonalities in the gaps of most people's preparations. And I have to tell you, one of the biggest ones is having what we call a bug out bag in the disaster preparedness industry. And that is simply a backpack. That is a 72-hour evacuation kit where everything you need for independent survival is inside of that kit. All the food, all the water, all the, a fresh change of clothes, your hygiene kit, some basic tools for 3 days inside of a backpack. You can assemble a backpack like this for, literally on a shoestring budget of $100 and $150 if get stuff from thrift stores or from friends and family or just use extra stuff around the house. But one thing I've learned is that is an excellent first step into preparedness. Not does it only kind of allow you to tip your toes into all of these different survival categories, but time and time again, I've heard stories of people using their bug out bags and their emergency kits during a disaster and it making a huge difference.
And also, I think in terms of attitude, that's a really good idea. That's a great idea because people are familiar with backpacks. That doesn't
Mm-hmm.
seem like something they don't know anything about, right? You send the kids to school with a backpack or you go camping or whatever. So that's something, it's kind of like, wow, yeah, well, I can pack a backpack for everybody and have it ready for a disaster, right?
A-
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. And you know what this exercise does for families is it builds confidence and it gets them started in the vein of in the line of thought of I want to start making some of these important decisions before the disaster strikes because we all see the headlines where people are filling up pickup trucks with toilet paper in the midst of a disaster, and all that is a result of panic and fear and horrible decisions in the midst of chaos rather than making these decisions before the event happens so that you already have a good plan. It's just about executing it in the midst of disaster. And I try to be an optimist, but I always say the next disaster is next week. We are all susceptible to disaster in the world, especially with the increased number of natural disasters that happen. And, we see all kinds of man-made disasters as well.
And what about what happened in COVID? Maybe you can talk to us a little bit about that because that's probably, if not
Yep.
COVID, bird flu, we're going to get some kind of viral infection that's going to be worldwide. Can we do things differently than we did when we first confronted COVID?
Well, I wish I was an expert on what was better and what was worse with COVID. But one thing that COVID did do, COVID is a shelter in place type of disaster. Pandemics are typically shelter in place versus an evacuation. So the importance of having food, water, prescription medicines, things like
Toilet
that,
paper?
toilet paper, things like that at
Yeah.
home, just in case you got to hunker down for a few weeks or a few days. But one interesting thing that COVID really did is it really made people think about about preparing for disaster, because for the first time, people were quarantined in their houses and really faced with the reality of, man, if I couldn't go to the grocery store, do I have everything I need in my house for my family? And I think it was a huge wake up call for a lot of people. Maybe preparedness was discussed in, behind closed doors and in the basements, or before COVID, but after COVID, I think everyone was talking about it. Everyone was saying, you know what, I need to get basic preps in place, because this felt really weird to me.
Yeah, wake
And
up call is really because, as Americans, we're really not used to that.
mm-hmm,
We go to the grocery store, it's always there. They might not have everything we want, and as you said in the beginning, water, food. I mean, wake up call in
yeah,
capital letters, like, whoa, what do we do? Uh,
yeah. And
yeah,
even when they did go to the grocery, oftentimes, we also take for granted that everything's going to be in stock in America all the time. And that was a time when it wasn't. And it was a time when a lot of people, at least in my life, that I had never heard talking about long-term food storage or preparedness issues. I got a lot of questions during that time, being in the position that I'm in. In fact, I wrote a book during COVID called "The Disaster Ready Home," which kind of opened the door for this book we're talking about today, which is Disaster Survival 101.
yeah. Here's one that you talk about that when I grew up, which was scary. And you do mention nuclear disasters. I always
Mm-hmm.
like, you can't do anything. That's the end. Forget about it. Not true.
Not true. Not true at all. And if you're in the blast zone of a nuclear bomb, that's true, right? So you're not going to survive in a blast zone of a
Don't worry
nuclear.
about survival.
Yeah, yeah. So nothing survives that.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of people who are in a fallout zone from nuclear fallout, the radiation from nuclear bombs. That is, there's a lot of people in that zone, and there are absolutely things that you can do. That's a shelter in place disaster where you want to protect yourself from the radioactive fallout as much as possible by hunkering down in an interior room in your house. You want to tape off any ventilation that might go to the outdoors. And the good news is that fallout has a half-life, and over the course of several days, it becomes less and less and less dangerous. And so, yet again, an exclamation point behind the importance of having some water storage in your house, of having some long-term food storage in your house, of having some of those prescription medications that so many people are dependent on in your house to provide to for a couple of weeks minimum. A lot of people ask me, so Creek, how long should I prepare for? Well, that's different for everyone. Everyone has trepidation with that, but I say a minimum of 2 weeks and then work from there.
Yeah, so you, besides pills and people have all other needs, medical needs, et cetera, what about, and you do talk about this in the book, the disaster first aid kit. What should be in that?
So the way I like to describe a disaster first aid kit is a lot of people like to go out and just buy a first aid kit from the grocery store and think that they're good. Well, that's just filled with some band-aids and some, antibiotic ointment that really isn't going to do anything in the event of an actual injury. So we want to build a first aid kit that resembles what you might imagine a combat medic carrying. So remember in disaster that a lot of the first responders are already overwhelmed. So you may very well be the first responder for your family and may very well have to provide some actual first aid, whether it's a broken bone or heavy bleeding or a concussion, sprained ankles, burns, any of the real trauma injuries. So we want to have tourniquet. We want to have blood loss control. We want to think about splints. We want to have things for anaphylactic shock. We want to have kit items in our extensive first aid kit that can deal with actual injuries rather than just little bumps and scrapes. So that's a whole conversation in and of itself, getting into the details of that kit. But the good news is I list all of those items out specifically in the book to make your shopping list really simple and really easy. And you don't have to buy them all at once. You could buy a couple a month if you're on a tight budget.
Another, and I want to cover this before because we don't have a lot of time left, because you talk about evacuation vehicles. Like if you
Mm-hmm.
are, yeah, what do you do? Where do you go? What kind of vehicle do you go in? How does that work?
Well, for most people, your evacuation vehicle is going to be your daily driver, myself included. I don't have the budget for some kind of really fancy, dedicated bug out vehicle. Although when I was single, before I was married and had kids, I loved the idea of that and had one to play around with. But these days, our bug out vehicle is our family van. And I think more important than the vehicle itself is, making sure that you have items in the vehicle that can get you through an evacuation period. Number one is gasoline. If you're preparedness minded, you don't want to run on an empty tank all the time. You want to keep your tank 3/4 of the way full, especially during seasons. If you're in an environment like hurricane season or wildfire season, you want to make sure that your gas is topped off, or maybe even having a couple of 5-gallon containers of gas at home as a backup, so that you have gasoline to evacuate with. But you want to make sure that you're keeping your maintenance up on your vehicle, that your tires are good, that all your fluids are good, and that your vehicle is in proper running order, and that you have some supplies in your vehicle that are ready for the environment. If you live in the north where it's cold in the winter, you should have extra clothes just in case you had to walk. You should have a shovel. You should have extra items that are specific to the season and the environment that you live in. So you want to think about your vehicle as a big backpack, right? So what should I put in my vehicle just in case I needed to evacuate and I might be kind of stuck for a while in my vehicle? What do I need in there? And I cover that in the book in great detail.
That's great because I picture, you see on television people evacuating and it's, bumper to bumper traffic. And they're talking about, a 20-minute drive becomes a 4-hour drive. And also, I'm assuming what you're saying applies to people who have electric vehicles. Make sure that,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that those are uh, electrified or whatever.
Absolutely charged
Charged.
up. That's
Yeah,
right.
charged up. They have to be charged up. So that is key. Um, all right, we only have, as I say, now we have about 3 minutes left. So I know that you have classes and stuff that we can, besides reading the book, which is
Yeah.
great, and we've only covered really a small part of the book just to kind of whet your appetite. The book is Disaster Survival 101, The Essential Guide to Preparing for and Surviving Any Emergency Scenario. And the author is Creek Stewart. That's who I've been talking to. But there are other resources that you have to give us in terms of what you do.
Absolutely. So the hub for everything Creek Stewart is simply creekstewart.com. And hop on my email list. I will give you my three best-selling pocket field guides for free when you do that. I've written a lot of books on the subject of disaster preparedness and wilderness survival, and my passion in life is working with and teaching people. And I believe these things really, really matter. That's why I do it. And I get feedback and stories almost every single day from people where they've made a difference in their lives. And I always say that it's not a matter of if, but when it comes to some kind of sudden and unexpected disaster in your life.
Yeah, I so agree with that, obviously. And I was, not just your fans and others, but your family. They must love you. I mean, they're ready to go.
Yeah, so
They should be.
here's something I hear all the time.
Yeah.
Creek, I'm not going to worry about it because I'm just coming over to your house.
Yeah, I was
And
going to say.
and that's one thing about being prepared is that you do put yourself in a position to help other people. And at the end of the day, that's what life is all about.
Exactly. Thanks so much for being on the show today. Really great information. And I appreciate it. And so does the audience. Thank you.
Well, likewise, thank you for the opportunity.
Joining me today is Dr. Ran Anbar, author of The Life Guide for Teens, Harnessing Your Inner Power to Be Healthy, Happy, and Confident. Today's generation of teenagers is living in a world no one could have imagined just a couple decades ago, a world of social media and an endless flow of information and disinformation. They are also more likely to be lonely, depressed, stressed out, and diagnosed with mental health issues than any generation before them. Dr. Ran Anbar takes a deep dive into the most prevalent wellness concerns for teens. He guides readers through such topics as anxiety, relationships, sleep, making tough decisions, and communicating effectively with easy to implement tools and advice from experts and teens who have been there. He's helped thousands of teens work through their personal challenges, not by solving their problems for them, but by helping them learn to tap into their inner wisdom, strength, and resilience. He is board certified in both pediatric pulmonology and general pediatrics, and is a regular columnist for Psychology Today Online. Welcome to the show, Dr. Rand Anbar.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, so I guess I said the first sentence that I said in the beginning of the intro, we've had more problems with teenagers. They have more problems than ever before in the past, let's say, 20 years. Why is that?
Well, I think you nailed it on the head. It involves with social media and all the information they get. So, for example, um, when we are exposed to information 24/7, we think that everything happens in small corners of the world is everywhere. When I was growing up, if there was a school shooting somewhere, you might have heard about it in the evening news, but if you missed it, you didn't even know about it. Now it's all over the place. And so kids grow up in a world where they think things are really bad because they hear about bad stuff all the time. That raises their anxiety. So that's number one. Number two, the social media is very enticing. Many kids are on social media 5, 10 hours a day, including in the middle of the night, to contact their friends and watch videos, and that makes them lose sleep. Lack of sleep leads to anxiety, depression, suicidality. And so you can see how it all feeds into itself.
Yeah, it feeds into each other, and you've described kind of a very dark situation. I guess the next question is, so how do we, mitigate the sort of the repercussions of all of that? Do parents have any control? I mean, you're not going to get rid of social media because people talk about social media, not good. And you gave one reason, there are lots of reasons, but it is here to stay. I mean, that's their life. That's our life too, as adults.
Well, you have to learn to take control of your life. As a teen, it's a little bit tougher because you have poor impulse control. It's part of growing up is learning to control your impulses. So, first of all, I encourage parents and their teens to sit down together and review the evidence or review why the benefits of social media. There are benefits, obviously, and also the things that are not good about it. And for example, electronics should be kept out of the bedroom, in my opinion, after bedtime or after 9 o'clock at night. But that should be done ideally with your teenager's assent as opposed to enforcing it on them. And they can understand, they shouldn't be able to understand why, because if they're up at night, they're losing sleep. Sleep is so important for even growth if you want to be tall, for example. And most teens will agree that this is reasonable. Many teens find it hard to control themselves. In that case, especially the young teens, with their agreement, their parents might say, okay, at 9 o'clock, you have to turn your phone to us, or we're going to turn off the internet. But a lot of teens don't need that. So that's the first thing. You want to contain its use. Another
Okay.
thing teens need
Oh,
to
I
understand.
just want to comment on that because that has to do with health, mental health, physical health, and I think it focuses on health. But then you talk about the happiness piece. Like they're not going to be happy about this. I don't think. I'm making that assumption. Teens are going to want to mostly balk at that or try to get away with not doing it. Parents go to bed. They're teenagers. They're not little kids. They can stay up and stay in bed and kind of do what they want.
That is true, and that's part of being a teenager. It's not just social media. It's you talk about going out, leaving the house without permission, using drugs. There's all sorts of things teens can do, and part of the parent's job is to keep communication open with their teen, make sure the teen understands the consequences of poor choices, and encourage him to make good choices. Social media is no different, other than it's even more ubiquitous than some of these other problems.
So, okay, so teenagers are struggling with anxiety and depression and all of these things that we mentioned in the beginning. So we're enlightening them, as you say, we should be, but then how do we get them and you talk about this obviously in the book, to be caretakers for themselves, for them to do that themselves, and to understand the importance of it.
Well, so for example, if you find if the reason that teen is on social media is they're lonely, and this is the way they communicate with their friends, you can help your teen figure out ways that they can communicate with their friends outside of social media. Maybe they can join a club, maybe they can join a sport. So you can have that kind of discussion. Some teens use internet to study on their own, and maybe you can encourage them to study in groups like we used to. So there are other solutions to what the teen is seeking from the electronics, but they may not have thought about it because in this generation, the electronic is the first go-to.
So in your book, you have, and I see this, 100 actionable tools teens can actually use to have or to complete their personal journeys to becoming well, to wellness. So that's really, so it's very practical. We're going to, obviously, we're talking about some of them, but not all of them. Um, let's talk about the pressures on teenagers, because you do discuss that. What are some of the pressures? First romantic or sexual relationships, or there's pressure to be really top student, top athlete. There's all kinds of pressures, both on social media and just within family or friends, or even teachers.
True. So teens face a lot of pressures. That's nothing new. One of the first things I emphasize to teens is that there could be external pressure, but you have control of how much you internalize of that pressure. So you can be pressured to excel in your sports and be a top player, but you don't have to feel that same way. You can instead, for example, in the case of sports, focus on improving when you play, not focus on whether you become the top athlete, because only a few people can become the top athlete. But if you understand that as long as you're improving, you're doing a good job, then it reduces the pressure. When teens look at colleges, for example, some teens think, well, I have to get into the top college to have a great life. And I say, that's not true. You can go to any college, most any college, work hard and do well. The key is working hard, and that you always have control over.
Yeah, I like that. That's an improvement. You don't have to be the best. And as you say, most people won't be the top, the number one, or even the number two. But you certainly, everybody can improve, no matter where you are, right? Yeah. Um, in each chapter, you have this teen to teen. Now, what is that? How does that work? A teen to teen chapter. What does that
Right,
tell us? Yeah.
right. So each chapter starts with an issue like anxiety or sleep, you mentioned. And then there'll be a short explanation of why this is an important issue, followed by a number of tools you can use to deal with that issue. And then there's a section teen to teen where teenagers who've dealt with that issue tell the reader, this is what I did. I actually was very fortunate in writing this book. I have teenagers in my office all the time, and I had them read drafts of the chapters. So this has been teen approved with the book in front of you. And so they say, hey, well, this is what I did. And then I quoted them because I think when teens hear from other teens, it is more real for them. It's somebody who's really there. And there's one last section of the chapter which I think is really useful, and that is a page for the parents or a note to parents. And these are meant for the teens to read, but share with their parents. So it sort of tells, for example, a parent of a child with anxiety should not solve the problem that's causing anxiety for the teen, but it should help them solve it or guide them in how to solve it, but leave it up to their child. Because when a parent solves a problem for the child, they take away the opportunity for the child to learn how to cope better.
Do you think that I keep going the 20 years, maybe even 30 years interim of parenting. Today's parents seem to, and obviously not all parents, but they want to do it for their kids. They're so overly involved. They want to make sure that everything is good and right for the kid and makes them happy, and don't allow the kids to make mistakes. And I don't want to say suffer, but understand the consequences of making poor choices. That need to like take over.
That is such an important point you're raising. So, parents today want the best. Well, parents have always wanted the best for their children, but today's version is I need to make sure nothing bad happens to my child. And you have two kinds of parents. You may have heard about the helicopter parents and also the bulldozer parents. That's a relatively new term for me. The helicopter parents micromanage their child just to make sure everything is just right. And the bulldozer parents does even worse, in my opinion. They clear the field so the child never encounters obstacles. And what parents need to understand is uh, part of growing up is learning to deal with obstacles, is learning to fall down and stand up again. That is an important part of growing up because when you get to real life, adult life, you face obstacles and your parents aren't going to be there to save you. And if you have not learned how to cope effectively with obstacles, you will have a difficult time.
You're
I
in
give
big
this an
trouble.
I give this analogy. When a toddler learns to walk, you watch a 2-year-old learning to walk. They fall down, they get up, they fall down, get up, and then ultimately they learn to walk. That falling down is part of the learning process. The body and the mind is learning, well, you can't walk that way. And it's a necessary part to learn how to walk. If a parent always held onto their child's hands when they were learning to walk, that child wouldn't walk very well because they wouldn't learn how not to walk. So failure and messing up and making poor choices and living with the consequences is part of growing up. So parents need to just sort of observe. They should only really intervene, especially with the older teens, but even younger teens, if it's a life-threatening issue. The child's going to start using drugs or act in a way that they put their life at risk.
So in your practice, and you're seeing kids, or you're a pediatric specialist, how do you guide the parents and help them to realize this, or how much, that has to be part of the whole, I guess, the whole process, right? If they're clearing the field, you have to, and why, I guess you have to dig into why they feel or have the need to do that.
Right. So a lot of parents have anxiety themselves, and one of their anxieties is that child will suffer, so they don't want that to happen. Or they fear if they do the wrong thing, their child won't grow well. I've seen kids are so overprogrammed, they're involved in 55 different activities because the parent thinks this makes them a well-rounded person, but it doesn't let the child be a child, which is trial and error and experiment and having fun. So yes, a lot of times it involves guiding the parents. Sometimes the issue that is brought in front of me as a child's problem is not even a child's issue. It's the parents' issue and how they handle it.
Yeah, because you talk about how does a teen best handle disappointments? Well, how do the parents handle the disappointments? Because I think that is key.
Correct. And I encourage parents to read this book as well, The Life Guide for Teens, because the life guide works for many things throughout life. And some of the skills the parents don't have. And if they master it, they can become more effective parents.
By the time people, let's say in your practice, get to you, I'm assuming that they're in pretty bad shape. They are tough teens, tough parents. Can give us, or do you have kinds of situations? Maybe the kids are into drugs or really engaging in risky behavior. How do you extricate them from that?
Well, a lot of times kids appear really tough because communication is broken down between them and their parents. And so the first thing you want to help is establish communication. And that involves a number of steps. First, the child and parent need to learn to respect each other. Parents often disrespect their kids. They don't know anything. and the kid says, well, parents don't know anything. They're from a different generation. And we want to work through that. There are things to learn from one another. Another part of communicating better is what I call active listening. So when a parent or a child speaks, the other person needs to listen completely and then repeat back. This is what I understood you to say. Because so often a parent will go on for several minutes talking about their viewpoint, and then I'll ask the child, what did the parent say? And they can't even start, they don't even know. And I explained to the parent, you see, you can talk and think your child is registering, but they're not. So when you talk to them, talk in brief sentences, make sure they understand. So improve communication. Now, you mentioned really tough situations, uh, drugs. So, if somebody's addicted, it's more than I can really help in an office setting sometimes with a once a week session because they might be chemically addicted, so they should go to an addiction center. But if we're dealing with kids who are running away or kids who are truant in school, oftentimes the issue is people have not heard the child's point of view or have not responded to it. So when the child feels, hey, somebody is listening to me, or my parents are starting to understand me, then they're less apt to engage in the destructive behavior.
You also talk about finding meaning in life. Finding meaning in life improves mental health. How does a kid find meaning in life? I mean, it sounds like something one would do maybe later in life. Things haven't worked out too well, and we're trying to find meaning in our lives as adults. But what about with the kids, the teenagers?
So another great question. And a lot of the crises I see in kids in the 16, 17 is to say life is meaningless. What's the point? I met one 17-year-old who said, there's no point in me trying because I'll never be the best. So what's the point? Somebody else will do it better. And then you have to work through that. And again, understand that there are billions of people in this world and everybody has something they can do uniquely. Um, and yes, you're correct. Meaning is something that you gain as you go through life, and it changes as you get older. But is essential to, at least in my opinion, have an understanding there is a meaning, there is a reason for life, even if you don't fully understand it. And you can, as a teen, start to appreciate that by, first of all, looking at other people who have found meaning. If you belong to a house of worship, you can find it there. Or I teach many of my patients how to interact with their subconscious, their inner self. And the inner self usually has a pretty good sense of meaning or purpose, and they can share that with a teen. And while the teen may not be there yet, when they realize they have it within them, they start opening up their eyes. Let me tell you one quick story. I was working with a 15-year-old during COVID, and he says to me, the world is a very dark place. I don't see any good future for me. And I stopped, turned, looked at him. We were actually walking outside because I wasn't doing indoor counseling. So we were walking. I stopped, looked at him, and said, but you're the light. And slowly it dawned on him what I was saying to him, that he can shine the light. And he actually contacted me 5 years later and said, I understand now what you said. I am the light. I can see that.
That's an enlightening story. That's a great story. I guess, yeah, he's the light. That's exactly it. What did you say, 5 years later?
Right.
What about siblings? You have, a family, three kids. One teen is doing great, and the other one not so great. How does that work?
Well, it is interesting, isn't it? That the same
Yeah.
parents, same environment, very different children. And that's something I learned personally before I even did this professionally is every child is different. So what works with one child may not work with your next child. So you need to, as a parent, you need to learn to be flexible and address each child's needs. Now, how do you develop that flexibility? Well, you need to listen to your children. Again, many parents think they know best, and they probably do, but they think because they know best, they should impose their point of view on their children. And that does not work when you're dealing with teens. So even though you might know the right decisions, again, listen to your child, see their point of view, and then if you disagree, explain why in a gentle way, in a supportive way, not in an accusatory way. And don't say things like, well, that's a dumb idea, because the words you use as a parent sink into your child. If you tell your child you're lazy because you're not doing your homework or you'll never amount to anything, they internalize it and that's what they become. So you have to be very careful what you tell your child. So a child who's not doing their homework, as a parent, you can say, hey, I believe in you. I know you can do better. You've done better before and you'll do better again. Or if they're not involved in any activities, let's work together to find something you really like to do outside of school. So you want to be a supporter, not an enforcer, as a parent of a teenager, ideally.
So you have to combine all these things that we've been talking about for the past half hour, but you really have to listen, communicate, and what I'm hearing you say, you have to sit down. Each child is different. I think that's difficult for parents sometimes. They have a plan. This works. It's going to work for all three of my kids, but that's not true. And I think the other thing, maybe you can comment on this. Sometimes there's a really good chemistry between one parent or both parents and one kid. And the other kid just emotionally, or I'm using the word chemistry, doesn't fit into the family system as well, just because of the differences in chemistry.
Right, that's true. Of course, you don't want to show overt favoritism towards one child. That creates problems for both children, actually. Um, and I would say this is part, nothing's perfect in life. But even in a child with whom you don't share chemistry, you can find common ground and you can be supportive. As a therapist, I work with many different children. Some children I have chemistry with, and other kids I don't. But I can help virtually all kids who want help. And I think most children in their homes would love to get their parents' support, but in a way that works for them. So I think parents, again, need to be flexible. So if a child of yours doesn't respond to what you think should work, don't get stuck on, well, it should be this way. Don't get stuck there. You should be asking yourself, what do I need to do to make this work? And you could also ask your child. There was one child who liked to play Pokemon Go, which is a game in which you capture imaginary Pokemon that you can see on your app, but they're out in the real world. And he would go out with his father, and the father would yell at him, "Don't go in the street! Don't go in the street!" Because the kid wouldn't pay attention to where he was, which is one of the dangers of Pokemon Go, is you go unsafe places without noticing it. And the child said to the father in my presence, he says, "Well, that makes me feel bad when you yell at me. Instead," he said, "why don't you just tell me when I stay on the sidewalk, good job for staying on the sidewalk." And I said, "Well, that's a great idea, because one of the things we teach, it's better to oftentimes to teach with carrots as opposed to with sticks." I
Yeah.
told the father, "Do what the child says." And that fixed the problem. The father encouraged him when he did well, and then he stopped going to the street.
Yeah.
So
I think
sometimes,
No,
right.
I think that's really that's an important point, because I think as parents we tend to say, don't do this, don't do that, but okay, don't do that. But what about, hey, that's great. You're doing something, this is good for you. And we don't accentuate the positive, I guess. It's focusing on the negative. One last question. I think we have time for this, but like when parents disagree, because they come from different uh, nuclear families and they have had different parenting themselves and they strongly disagree about issues related to their teenagers.
Well, it's really important for the parents to talk uh, between themselves when the teen is not around, to come to some compromise. It is very unfair to children when their parents disagree, the disagreements in public, or they give their child opposing opinions, because what's a child to do? If the child follows one parent's opinion, then the other parent is alienated or becomes angry with them. So if you're going to be parents, this is one of the deals. If you want to be an effective parent, is to talk to your spouse and come to some agreement. Otherwise, you end up with an unhappy family and an unhappy child who's not well adjusted.
Life Guide for Teens. This we've been talking uh, to Dr. Ran Anbar, and he's the author of the Life Guide for Teens, Harnessing Your Inner Power to Be Healthy, Happy, and Confident. There's so much in this book. We've covered some of it, but certainly not all of it. And I'm going to reiterate this because it's very practical. It gives you very practical advice. It's not overwhelming. It's not too much psychology for the average parent. So and I'll repeat this again, 100 actionable tools teens can use, which is really important. So, okay, doctor, tell us where we can get the book and websites and platforms we can go to for more information about your work and about your writing. And you write in Psychology Today online.
Thank you again for the opportunity to talk with you and to share some of what I've learned. To find out, you can order the book on Amazon.com or wherever books are sold. If you want more information about my work, you can look up dranbar.com, which is N as in Nancy, B as in boy, AR.com.
Great. Thanks so much for being on the show today. We appreciate it. Lots of good information for all of us, including myself. And yeah, great. Go out and get the book.
Thank you.